Hi, folks. Welcome back. It's Alex Ford again. And welcome to the second part of this series called Communities of Principle. If you've missed any of this, you can catch up on my blog, andallat.co.uk. In the first part, we looked at the power of professional communities and particularly subject communities in moving forward our practice as teachers towards really high quality history education for our children and young people. In this second part, however, I said I wanted to focus on some of the problems of communities, and that's what we're really going to go into today. So I hope this just gives a little bit of food for thought as we continue to think about the power of communities in our education system. Communities can unite around all kinds of issues. We looked at the Chartists at the beginning, but actually communities can unite in very similar ways without being a positive force for truth and justice. A group of people protesting against the unfairness of the system with violence at the end of it, well, that could equally be this. The people who went to the MAGA march, which stormed the Capitol building, of course, see themselves as a community. And Donald Trump has done an amazing job. It's one thing he has done an amazing job of making people who feel like outsiders feeling like they're the inside of a powerful community that needs to be listened to. So not every community acts in a positive way. Not every community is a positive force for what Mark Bloch would call truth and justice. Communities can act in negative ways. Your shared principles, if they are principles that are not inclusive ones, can very easily become principles that lead to really negative actions, that come to closing down actions. And so communities, as much as they can empower, inspire, support and challenge, they can also exclude. If you're not part of a community, you can be pushed to one side. They can silence people. They can ignore people. They can preserve power. And rather than creating diverse, engaging, rigorous, life-enhancing history for everybody in a history community sense here, they empower some people, but they disempower others. And I want to look at that in a little bit more detail. So up until this point, I portrayed Mark Bloch's formation of the Annales School as kind of a positive move to create and build a movement for change in the discipline of history. But actually, Bloch was very much reacting to the fact that the other communities, the other professional communities in the discipline of history were problematic. He very much found himself as an outsider in this community. He refers all the time to the broader community of historians as the guild. And I think that brings up very different images, doesn't it? A guild is a community, but a guild is often a community, and we think of that being about preserving power. We think about that as being excluding others, about control. And of course, Bloch was very much an outsider in another way as well, because as a Jewish historian in 1920s France, he is already in the midst of a growing anti-Semitism that's been rife in France since the 1880s. France, interestingly, is probably one of the most anti-Semitic countries in Europe in the 1880s, even more so than Germany of that period anyway. And they've just gone through things like the Dreyfus Affair. And so Bloch, although he loves being a professor at Strasbourg, at the University of Strasbourg, he gets a position there because he cannot get a position in the Sorbonne. Strasbourg's a new university. They're willing to take a risk on who they're going to take on board. It took him a long time and a lot of connections to get a position in Paris at the Sorbonne, despite being such a brilliant historian. So Bloch is very much reacting to problems in the wider community. And his community is set up in an effort to change that. But it's more than just that, because post-1940, of course, the Nazis and Hitler's Nazis invade France. And ultimately, France capitulates, and we end up with the setup of the Vichy regime. And from that point onwards, Bloch has a dual struggle. This is not just about a struggle against a guild of historians who he believes silence different approaches to historical study, but it's also a struggle against a much wider problem of a rejection of liberal and inclusive values, that every human life is of equal value, that truth is worth pursuing. And so Bloch, when he is writing The Historian's Craft in 1942, during the midst of France having been invaded, is responding to the need for historians to do more to fight back against not just an attack on history, but an attack on the very concepts of truth and inclusivity and human value and human dignity that he sees as so central to the Republican ideal, as well as his conception of a humanizing history. And of course, we know an awful lot about how the Nazis manipulate history to their own ends as well. So when Bloch is writing, he talks about history needing to be written with integrity and truth. And that's not a throwaway comment, the kind of thing, we need to be accurate. That is a very direct challenge to historians who he believes are perpetuating problematic narratives of French history because of the prevailing political winds. And so Bloch's community in 1942, the Annales School, which is very much on the outside by then, and Bloch has been banned from his university. He writes the Historian's Craft with no books. He writes it just from kind of memory and his notes. So that community is really struggling against this overwhelming body that's pushing against all the things they hold to be true and important and dear. And he doesn't just take aim at the historians who he thinks are complicit in this, the Guild, but he also takes aim at teachers, and he says it's a scandal in our own age, which is more than ever exposed to the poisons of fraud and false rumour. The critical method is so completely absent from our school programmes. And my goodness, that idea of the poisons of fraud and false rumour, that could be written today, really, couldn't it? The school teachers are not doing enough to counter this idea of what history is and the manipulation, the abuse of history, and the denigration of truth. And it's not just in 1940s France that there's problems. Clearly, that is a very extreme example. But actually, there are huge problems in our own history teaching community, in that broad body of history teaching we talk about. There are lots of powerful voices in the history teaching community, and there are lots of powerful communities. But many of them are failing to challenge adequately many of the problems that exist in our schools and our, the way that our children are taught. And just going back to Bloch's point there is a massive lack of inclusivity. History is a difficult subject anyway, and lots of children are being put off keeping studying it. There is a pedagogical narrowing. So that idea that, God forbid, children should have some enjoyment when they study is being really challenged at the moment. And there aren't enough powerful voices challenging that idea. That there are massive silences in our curriculum, and that we have this kind of core national narrative, and certainly since 2014, an increasingly nationalist narrative being promoted by really key schools, key voices in the education community, and particularly within the history community, that say, this is important. We need to have a nationalist or national narrative, but really what we end up with is a nationalist narrative. Is there enough challenge to that? I think not. And there are silences in the history teaching community itself, which I'll come to later. Not everybody is being represented. So when Ofsted talks of the history teaching community thinks, or, we need to tap into the knowledge of the history teaching community, not everybody is being heard in that discussion. And that is a huge problem. Let's take each of those briefly in turn. There is a big problem with accessibility in history education. The new GCSEs are much harder. You need fewer marks, therefore the papers are harder. It's almost twice as hard for a student to get an E. It's nearly 40% harder to get a C than it was in the past. What does this mean? It means increasingly students are being put off from studying history. It creates enormous problems of progression too. Students with special educational needs have a dreadful rate of progression into GCSE and then into A-level especially. Very few students with special educational needs go on to study history at A-level. There is a huge problem there. It's not being robustly enough challenged by history teachers and the history teaching community at large. Then we've got the pedagogical issues, the input recall pitfall, as I like to call it. You will know, of course, that the new Ofsted handbook, inspection handbook, talks about teachers being experts in their subjects that they teach. That teachers check pupil understanding, they embed concepts in long-term memory. And of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But if you take that as a recipe for how you should teach rather than the end points of teaching, that children should have a body of knowledge and they should know it, it becomes very quickly quite problematic. So we get some exhortations like this one here that comes from a series of textbooks, and it has a teacher's guide, and this is how it's telling teachers they should go about teaching. Read the new material, condense the new material into a new format. by putting a storyboard, annotating a map, annotating an image. What is going on here? Well, not an awful lot of thought. If we take what's been written and just turn it into a new format, what we're really doing is transmitting a body of knowledge from one place to the other. We're not giving students a chance to engage with it or think about it or care about it or develop an opinion about it. And I think that's a problem. And there aren't enough powerful voices challenging that narrative. And it gets really interesting when you then look at, in the same teacher's guide, what are the ideal answers to some of the questions that students are being asked? Well, here are three. Which country provided the keenest explorers in medieval Europe? What a fascinating question. Because we're now getting an idea of the kind of narrative we're telling. Portugal apparently did. But one person's explorers, of course, are another person's colonisers. It's a really interesting choice of terminology. Why did so many native people of the Americas die after Europeans made first contact? So many died because they had no immunity to diseases carried by European settlers. Well, yes, that is true. And there is a horrific thing of death brought by European settlers. But equally, there's an equally horrific period where European colonisers murder tens of thousands of indigenous peoples and dispossess them of land. And that isn't mentioned in that book nearly at all, actually. What advantages did Cortes and the conquistadors have when fighting Aztecs? Well, the Aztecs, in comparison, were a Stone Age civilization. So again, how is it that students are thinking? So when we do this input recall, it's all very well to input some knowledge and get students to remember it. But if you're not teaching them to think about it, they can very quickly absorb really problematic ideas about what that means. And that's a textbook from 2018. And then when you couple that with some sort of schooling systems that are zero tolerance, that say things like your teacher is the boss, your teacher is the expert. This comes from a real school, by the way. Your teacher is the expert. You never interrupt your teacher, even if you don't agree what your teacher is saying. And so we've got some hugely problematic pedagogies being developed. And I genuinely think those are being under-challenged by the most powerful voices in the history education community. And that floats over into the way we talk about cultural capital. You know, cultural capital, this idea that we transmit a body of knowledge to students, has become very, very popular. And what it means in many cases, and I've chosen a couple of examples here from powerful schools and powerful academy chains, is that we're returning to a version of curriculum that looks like it's fallen out of the 1950s. So we have a very English, very political narrative, Anglo-Saxons, medieval kings, crusades, late medieval, Henry VIII and the Reformation, age of exploration. Now the age of exploration is massively problematic for reasons we've touched on already. And even that story for year 7, where's the first, ordinary person they meet? Well, potentially in late medieval, but not necessarily. Lots of this is about power, lots of this is white, lots of this is male. So there's very, very little. It's a very traditional curriculum. In fact, in the second school below, you can see it's even called our traditional curriculum, the traditional curriculum. And it talks here, the content of the history curriculum at school is chosen to best illustrate the powerful knowledge which historians should own. Interesting choice of phrase. The development of England over a few hundred years, from tribal squabbling to the formation of the world's first coherent parliament, the slow struggle against slavery and prejudice in 19th century Britain and beyond. It's a really problematic narrative of British exceptionalism. And it's not getting enough challenge. You know, there are plenty of people saying, we wouldn't teach like this. But in the most powerful voices in our community, not so much. And we see that again in this textbook. The framing of this textbook is really interesting. We talked about the Age of Encounters a minute ago. Columbus's journey across the Atlantic blew the world wide open. Soon a constant stream of explorers was sailing from Portugal to Spain to explore these lands further. And we miss the colonising part of that. We miss the perspective of the indigenous peoples. So we've got this really problematic set of narratives being supported by problematic textbooks. That's written in 2018, as I think I pointed out a minute ago. And this is not getting robust enough challenge from powerful voices, powerful communities. In fact, I think this is a lovely quote from Eric Foner. And this is from the US context, but actually it applies here too. He says, "This history we were taught could not have produced the present we're living in." This history we were taught could not have produced the present we were living in. And I think of those examples I've just shown you, that history could not have produced the present that we are living in. So what's all the impact of that? Well, the impact of an error curriculum is people who feel increasingly alienated from history. Tenny Oladane produced an amazing piece of research in teaching history, the current issue, in which she interviewed some people who'd been at school a few years ago and talked about the impact of curriculum on them. And I think it's worth just picking up a few of these here. Abigail, 21. I was taught history like people who looked like me didn't exist. I remember being taught about the British Empire in Year 9, having to list reasons why it was important for Britain to colonise parts of Africa. Samira, I always dreaded Black History Month. It wasn't a time to celebrate the accomplishments of black Brits or black people in general. It was dehumanising and focused on slavery. These are curricula that cause hurt and damage to the people we are supposed to be there for, children, young people. And really powerful voices are not challenging that. But it's even worse if we look at the fact we hear about our history of slavery. It's like Africa never existed until the white man came. They're teaching multicultural education, but in a passive way. It's lip service. That was the Swan Report in 1985. Almost nothing has changed in 36 years. Not enough is being done to challenge these things. And that is because the most powerful voices in history teaching are not challenging those things robustly enough. So there's been a real lack of community response to all of this. In fact, if you looked at the pages of Teaching History, I did a survey of articles published since 2014 up to the end of 2019, and only 3 of those covered the issue of teaching more diverse history, and only 2 were covering any sort of other issue. Like, so there were 2 on challenging perceptions of women in history, versus 19 on the role of knowledge, 12 on using historians in class, 12 on written arguments, out of 170 odd articles in total. And of course, if we look at who the most dominant voices are, it becomes a little bit clearer. Well, we've got here on the left-hand side, some speakers at an important conference, a big conference, who are talking about what good curricula look like. We've got here John Blake of the Harris Foundation, who talks about a knowledge-rich curriculum. We've got Robert Peel here, who talks about rigorous knowledge-based curriculum and understanding history in detail. John Blake is the head of the academy chain with the first curriculum we looked at. Robert Peel is the author of that textbook. So the powerful voices, the dominant voices, the ones that are getting the most airtime, are getting listened to, are bringing in the biggest crowds, are part of the problem. And then some of them are not even historians. At least there's some history here. Catherine Birbalsingh, who's the head at the very controversial Michaela Free School. And don't get me wrong, there's some amazing things that happen at Michaela, but she talks here about putting dead white men back on the timetable. Well, I wasn't aware they were ever off the timetable. And yet here is an incredibly powerful woman with a lot of governmental backing, saying we're putting dead white men back on the curriculum. And of course, other schools take that message and go, well, we better kind of echo that. We better mirror that, for good reasons, because schools need to show they're keeping up with what's expected of them. So there are dominant voices in our professional communities, and some of those voices are not doing enough to challenge some of the issues we're facing: the lack of inclusivity, the pedagogical narrowing, the silences in curriculum, and the silences in the wider teaching community. But we can push back. So if we are part of professional communities that empower us, inspire us, support us and challenges, and those communities have principles that are all about inclusion and creating rigorous in history for all, and allowing children to think for themselves, and challenging the silences in curriculum by being more diverse, then those communities can push back against the problems we see. Okay, so that's been quite a whistle-stop tour of some of the issues I think we see in the history or the communities in the wider history teaching community. And I think those are issues which are much broader than history as well, and they're not unique to history, but they certainly are problems which go under-acknowledged, I think, sometimes in and around conversations of professional communities in history, subject communities in history. So for the final part of this series, I'd like to go on to look at the ways in which we can engage with communities. So if we know they can be powerful and we know there are problems, how do we actually direct ourselves meaningfully towards engaging with professional communities and subject communities? Please do come back and join me for that when we talk about it next time. If you would like to get in a discussion about this or talk to about any of this, please do on Twitter. It's at APF102. Again, the Schools History Project website, you can go and find out a bit more about what we do. And Schools History Project is at 1972 SHP on Twitter. So I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks very much.